we are stuck. Can you please be quiet? This session is going to be presented by Mike Macnair, and the subject is the challenge of communist unity. Go ahead.
Okay. It's all around East Oxford at the moment is plastered with stickers saying, "Are you a communist? Then get organised." These stickers are advertising the organisation Socialist Appeal. And we offered Socialist Appeal a debate. This was what this session was scheduled to be, was a debate between ourselves and Socialist Appeal on the question of communist unity. But Socialist Unity declined. They didn't quite say fuck off, but they just said, no, we're not interested without much explanation. So you get just me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Socialist Appeal because in two ways, Socialist Appeal's initiative on this front are symptomatic of characteristics of the present left. And then I'm going to talk more generally about the question of communist unity. Why communist unity, not broad left unity? And how? I won't say how with any degree of optimism about that how, but in how in relation to things which we objectively need if we're going to get communist unity and some thoughts about that. So Socialist Appeal, the first is the fact Socialist Appeal turned us down for a debate is symptomatic. It's frankly equally unlikely that any of Socialist Appeal's bigger competitors would agree to a debate with Socialist Appeal. It's characteristic of all of these organisations that they're happy to debate with larger forces to their right, but very unhappy to debate with smaller forces, whether or not to their left. Moreover, each of the three organisations which are around 1,000 in size, the SWP, I know it claims many more members, but it's probably about 1,500 in size. Socialist Party of England and Wales, a bit under 1,000. Morning Star's Communist Party of Britain, 800, 900. Each of them seeks to characterise its competitors as sects who we don't have to take seriously, whereas we have the orientation to the broad masses, the real labour movement, whatever they want to call it. We can also see this in the Socialist Party of England and Wales walk out from Socialist Alliance in 2003, 2002, I think. So anyhow, 2002-3, and thereby enable the Socialist Alliance, which is quite a promising project in certain ways, rendered marginal. The Socialist Workers' Party's crisis over respect and effectively walked out of respect in 2007, 2008, because it wasn't doing what SWP wanted it to do, and their members had to talk, and their members were very uncomfortable about it, to talk about politics with non-members. There was great enthusiasm for keeping respect meetings to social activities, not political discussions, which were, it was said, for the broad masses not interested in political discussions. The Communist Party of Britain actually also displayed the same thing when its response to the flow of members into the Labour Party and members and former supporters of the CPGB into the Labour Party was to denounce this and say we are opposed to entryism and unwilling to pursue an affiliation tactic towards the Labour Party, which in the case of the Morning Star's Communist Party, an affiliate, or the SWP, or the Socialist Party in England and Wales, the pursuit of an affiliation tactic towards the Labour Party might have had some actual political impact on the Labour Party. The refusal in the case of the CPB is the fact that where they think of their relationship to, quote, the mass movement, is that the CPB should be preferred interlocutors of the trading bureaucracy and being preferred under the official lefts of the Labour Party, like Corbyn, McDonnell, Diane Abbott, and that being the preferred interlocutors involves leaving these big leaders in undisturbed possession of their memberships, so that the CPB is left in undisturbed possession of its membership, and so on. And in reality, actually, that's the reason which lies behind the SWB split with respect to the Socialist Party of England advises walk out from Socialist Alliance. They want their members to be corralled and not engaged in debate with other leftists. At the same time, on the one hand, these people want to corral their own members. On the other hand, they seek a privileged relationship with, quote, the broad left of one sort. Secondly, are you a communist, then get organised? Stickers are symptomatic in a different way. The self-identification of socialist appeal as, quote, communists is the latest in a series of rebrandings. Once upon a time, in 1944-49, the remote antecedents of socialist appeal are in the Haston Grant tendency of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was a Trotskyist organisation created by a fusion of several different Trotskyist organisations in 1944. And around about 1946-47, the American Socialist Workers' Party, which was the large organisation of the largest organisation before the International at that time, organised a disloyal faction in the RCP, like Jerry Healy, and then which was committed to Labour Party entry, though underlying that commitment was actually a commitment to loyalty to the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party, which Healy only broke from in the early 1960s. And they used their strength in the Fourth International to get authority for the Healy faction of the RCP to implement their entry in the Labour Party policy at the expense of the majority. The majority next stage was that the majority was deregulated. So the RCP then ends up, the majority is deregulated. Some of them attempt to go back into the Healy-led organisation and are purged successively. The Cliffites are purged, and then there's a group called the Left Faction, which I don't know what came of them, but Harry Selby, who was Labour MP, was the central, wound up as Labour MP, was the central leader. And then the Haston Grant tendency were purged. Haston, I think, went out of politics or went in just a Labour organisation. Grant constructed an organisation at that time called the International Socialist Group, and later called the Revolutionary Socialist League, and better known as, quote, militant. So Grant mutated from being the principal leader of opposition to entry into the Labour Party to one of the most consistent practitioners of entry into the Labour Party. The Grant Group was the third largest fraction of the old RCP. The largest fraction was the Healy Group. The second largest fraction was the Cliff Group, and the third largest fraction was the Grant Group. Subsequently, Healy went to open work with the Socialist Labour League in 1961, and in 1964-5 embarked on a series of provocations against the right wing in the Keep Left Young Socialists, which at that time was the youth organisation of the Labour Party, and got all his members slung out of the Labour Party in order to launch in the expectation that the SLL, Socialist Labour, would break through to mass party status in the short term. The Labour Party set up a new organisation, the Labour Party Young Socialists, but that was still infested with trolls. The Grant Group, the International Marxist Group, which was a group which had come out of the post-1956 splits in the Communist Party and moved towards the Fourth International. It's a very small group, half a dozen people at first, got up to about 50 in the mid-1960s. And the socialists, what became the Socialist Review Group, the Cliffites, contested the LPYS. But then in 1968-9, the Cliffites and the International Marxist Group bolted out of the YS and out of the Labour Party and went for open party building among the radicalised youth from the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign and other solidarity campaigns. And the Grantites were left in exclusive possession of the LPYS. Round about this time, Ted Grant came up with a variant of the Communist Party's British Road to Socialism, according to which you're to get a left Labour government and push it further left, etc. Grant's variant was the Marxist tendency in the Labour Party, which was militant, is to capture the Labour Party by winning policy through the Labour Party, and Labour government committee to socialist policies will be elected, and the Labour government committee to socialist policies will then pass an enabling act, as Adolf Hitler in 1933 passed an enabling act enabling the government to legislate by decree, and that will then nationalise the top 200 monopolies and etc. etc. So it's a variant of the British Road to Socialism because it's the same general idea. You win the Labour movement and you get a left Labour government. Because this was a variant of the British Road to Socialism, the consequence was that as long as the Grant Group kept to their turf in the Labour Party Young Socialists and didn't move outwards, the Communist Party led broad left in the Labour Party. I say Communist Party led, the Communist Party influenced broad left in the Labour Party, protected them from being purged. And when they did move out in National Organisation of Labour Students, a group of CP influenced Labour guys set up an organisation called Operation Icepick, which in the course of whose name should indicate what the nature of the operation is, which in the course of 1974-76 purged the militant thoroughly out of NOLS, National Organisation of Labour Students, left the National Organisation of Labour Students, controlled by this group which renamed itself Clause 4 after Clause 4 of the Labour Party Constitution. But the militant were left intact in the LPYS, and they grew in this context to around 5,000 members. So that by this late 1970s, early 1980s, the militant was by a long way the largest of the organisations of the British far left, because the Socialist Workers' Party, although it claimed larger numbers, had got to about 2,000, 2,500, stuck there. And the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which again had got up into the low thousands, had begun to fall into crisis in the late 1970s, go mad as well. Now, the Grantites went mad in the same way. Socialist Workers' Party went mad in mid-1970s. We're the party. Our International Socialists said, we're not a party, we don't have enough forces to be a party. Then they launched the Socialist Workers' Party as we're the party. Workers' Revolutionary Party, same thing, Healy Organisation, Socialist Labour League, the perfect sense of the title, few thousand, and then they say, we're the party, Workers' Revolutionary Party. the Grantites, it went a little bit further, and in the late 1980s, they became heavily involved in, they were both witch hunted in the Labour Party, mainly because the consequence of the Euro-communists getting full control of the old Communist Party was the protection of the old broad left was withdrawn from the military. And the Euro-communist leadership was in effect supporting witch hunting. But secondly, the militant became the leading tendency in the anti-poll tax campaign. They were the leading tendency in the anti-poll tax campaign because they were in the Labour Party and in the YS. Unlike the rest of the groups whose relationship to the class movement was through the trade unions, their relationship to the class movement was through the working class housing estates. That made them strong positions work in the poll tax. And Peter Taff, in that context, went mad in the way in which Cliff and Healy had gone mad before, and we got in 1991 the launch of the Socialist Party, not yet the Socialist Party of England and Wales. We could leave that on one side. Round Peter Taff as a public open party, and the Grantites split from this to retain entry. And after a period of silence, they launched Socialist Appeal, which was originally the name of the paper of the Revolutionary Communist Party, so back in the 1940s. So this is the historical continuity here is of some practical significance. And they stick as they're retaining entry. But in the early 2000s, the very limited possibilities of the Labour Party in the Blair administration lead them to turn their members towards Venezuela solidarity. And the Grantites become totally uncritical supporters of the Chavez regime, Chavismo, and the Chavez regime in Venezuela. This, in fact, led to splits. So, for example, Chavez's support for the Iranian regime meant that the Grantites, Iranian affiliate, which I guess wasn't much forces, but also a whole load of allies of the Grantites, Iranian people split. And there's a second split in 2016. So that this is during this period, between about 2004, which is when the AWL identified it as already having happened, and the late 2010s, the Socialist Appeal was primarily engaged in this Venezuela solidarity. And in fact, they had some difficulty in turning around the Corbyn movement because they had pulled back so much from the internal affairs of the Labour Party that so they rebranded themselves as Chavistas. First, so the Grantites, being Trots, were syndicalists in the 1940s. That this was an organisation, the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was built on the strike struggles against the coalition government in the 1940s, which the CP at that time was pursuing policy of class peace. So it was a very obscurist workability syndicalist organisation. Healy and Grant had rebranded their organisation as as a left variant of British Road to Socialists in the Labour Party youth in the 1950s, 60s. 60s, 70s, I guess. Now they hung on to the Labour Party orientation but abandoned it. Now they've rebranded themselves as Chavistas, and the latest, which is this year or perhaps last year at the earliest, is to start rebranding themselves as communists. Why are they rebranding themselves as communists? This is something they've avoided saying for practically 70 years. And the answer, I think, is that it's fashionable. There's a degree of fashionableness about the word communist, which is reflected in the growth of the Morning Star Communist Party of Britain's Young Communist League and its use of red flag imagery and so on. Also, equally in our friends in Cosmonaut's use of old communist iconography, imagery. It's not only those, etc., etc. The underlying commonality of this phenomenon of rebranding is the, quote, transitional method, unquote, according to which you have to make a bridge between existing consciousness and the tasks of the revolution, which means, in effect, actually following, rebranding yourself in whatever way is fashionable. The Grantites are a bit slower at this than the Mandelites of the various series of our incarnations of Mandelites, from the International Marxist Group to Socialist Action to the International Socialist Group to Socialist Resistance to what's now anti-capitalist resistance. But the same underlying method. Okay, so this is that's my moment of slagging off the socialist appeal, and the point is simply that their communism in these stickers is extremely superficial. I go on then to my substantive points, and the first is why communist unity rather than broad left unity. And the second is how, if at all. So why communist party unity rather than broad left unity, or broad left unity, new left, reconstructing the new left, democratic revolutionary but not socialist, party not delimited between reform and revolution, class struggle party, and Alan Thornick called it at one stage. The answer is actually the left has been trying to do this continuously for the since the 1980s. Different people starting at different times, but succession of attempts of this sort. I wrote roughly 3 weeks ago an article called "The Blind Leading the Blind." Jack's headline for it rather than mine, because it produced a nice graphic to go with it. But it's a great headline. The point which this article was addressing was the dominance of, quote, possibilism in the proposals which were being made in the debate or discussion in the Morning Star for various different sorts of left strategies. So that the method involved is to say, rather than starting from what's needed and thinking about how to insert what is objectively needed in the existing political discourses, we start from the analysis of what's possible, without any idea of what's needed except the vaguest possible sentimental attachment to socialism. So this was the discussion in the Morning Star, but it's actually equally true of all these proposals for broad left parties of one sort or another, going back to the International Marxist Group Socialist Unity electoral project in the 1970s, through the so-called Ben Scargill Livingston Current in the 1980s, through Scargill's Socialist Labour Party, through the Socialist Alliance, through Respect, etc., etc., etc. And the same thing actually true of an awful lot of the left formations of one sort or another in Europe over the same period. There are two fundamental problems with this approach, in my view. The first is that the capitalist class spontaneously throws up two-sided politics. The aspect of capitalism, which is market relations, throws up free market liberalism of anti-discrimination, the judicial power, but also deepening corruption and spiralling inequality. The other side of capitalist social relations is the factory. And it's not, I say the factory, but actually the earliest factory is the sailing ship. The cooperative organization of productive activity. Capital is money turned into commodities, which are then subject to a production operation, which are then in turn realized as changed commodities, which is then turned into enlarged money. That's capital. The movement of money M-C-P-C-M-. But the P in capitalist production is this cooperative organized production in the form in which labour is really subsumed and not merely formally subsumed to capital. It's this form which throws up the proletariat as a class. And so we get, for example, Line-born Rediker's many-headed hydra, the proletarian struggles of the seafarers and dockers in the 18th century, or the earliest anti-union laws, the Confederacy, the earliest English anti-union law, the Confederacies of Masons Act 1425, which penalises building workers combining to demand higher wages. It's this cooperative activity which creates the movement of the working class, which the capitalists are feared of. But it's this cooperative activity under authority creates the other side of capitalist politics, which is collectivist and can be actually, it is possible to get Tory governments to pass legislation like the 10-hour day act passed by Tory government under pressure from the Labour movement, but also with the idea of screwing over the Liberals. But conversely, is also the party of order is the party of collectivism, but it's also the party of nationalism, patriarchy, and Puritan politics. The party now of anti-abortion and the national conservatives advocating natalism, women should be made to have more children, or the extraordinarily fatuous campaign against drag queen story time as being a profound subversion of English values, all this stuff. The left, insofar as it starts with looking for the possible, winds up tailing either the Liberals or the Party of Liberty or the Party of Order. So, for example, the Lexiteers, the guys who advocated a left-wing Brexit, wound up in reality acting as foot soldiers for the right campaign of chauvinism like Brexit. On the other hand, the left remainers, like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty and the anti-capitalist resistance guys, tail the Party of Liberty and wind up merely acting as foot soldiers for that party, and that's become very visible in the Ukraine war, where these guys tail the warmongers. Arm Ukraine. Once upon a time, they would have said victory to the NLF in Vietnam. Now they say victory. They don't say victory to the USA, but their actual demands amount to victory to the USA. Secondly, what the possible is in the highest degree, there's lots of different possibles. The tactical possibles. So the CPB, whether it's really possible is another question, but the CPB is still pursuing an alliance with the trade union leaders and the official lefts, and this is the way, as long as we cling on to this alliance, we have a chance of moving on to the road of the British road to socialism. I've characterised this in the article as being like Wile E. Coyote. In the routine trope, Wile E. Coyote runs off the edge of a cliff, keeps running on thin air, and suddenly realises there's nothing beneath him but thin air, falls to the ground. They run off the edge of a cliff. It's almost impossible to imagine a more favourable set of circumstances for the project of the British Road than actually winning the leadership of the Labour Party for a supporter of the British Road, which is what Corbyn actually, for practical purposes, was. SWP are in a sense doing the same thing. They've been running with building people's fronts. Their basic line has been to build people's fronts in imitation of the official Communist Party ever since the Right to Work campaign in the late 1970s. And the anti-Nazi League was precisely a project of creating a people's front around anti-Nazism, as opposed to fighting against immigration controls and state racism. They're still doing it with a suit at the Stand Up to Racism. That's the thing. And then on the other hand, they are actually propagandistically recruiting guys out of campuses. Enough time has passed that the historian Martin Smith is no longer a major obstacle to them recruiting in precious fairs. Socialist Party of England and Wales, they have their project, their own project, which is the Trade Union Socialist Coalition, and persuading unions to disaffiliate with Labour, and alongside it, the National Shop Stewards Network, which is the Socialist Party of England and Wales' front, the trade union. Socialist Appeals project, as I say, Socialist Appeal is a lot bigger than us. It's sort of 400 odd organisation. Unsurprisingly, it was a substantial minority in the Socialist Party in the Grantite tendency at the time to split, but they've moved from Grantite Labour Party Enabling Act schema through to Chavismo in the first part of this century, through to now we're quote communists. All of these things in different ways are different attempts at the possible. And again, the Mandelites are now eco-socialists. What does this mean, eco-socialists? The reality is it just means that they want to tail the Greens. They've also become a big deal on trans rights. I'm not quite sure how they think. I think they think it's fashionable. The resulting appearance on the ground is unity around tactics. And the unity around tactics means that the unity doesn't last. That's absolutely transparent with the Mandelites, who built an organisation around commitment to entry in the Labour Party and building a Labour Party called Left in the early 1980s with a revolutionary faction within it. And then the Chesterfield conferences led the leadership to think that there might be more opportunities in working in the Chesterfield conferences. And the people who were most committed to entry in the Labour Party split off and went. And a succession of similar unifications and splits. For a while, they were with George Galloway against the Socialist Workers' Party, the Galloway wing of respect. But then Galloway decided to stand in Glasgow, and the Socialist resistance people, I must admit, people make splits on the most bizarre grounds, thought that the defence of the decaying corpse of the Scottish Socialist Party was more important than been maintaining their alliance with Galloway in respect and split with them. It was unprincipled to stand against the SSP. We get this notorious, the resulting appearance then is the famous Monty Python sketch of the Judean People's Front competing with the People's Front of Judea. And I can't remember, there are other organisations as well. But that's the one which has reached the point actually that it's totally widespread general view. It's the view which most people have of the far left, and the far left actually, in its practice, confirms that, reconfirms and reconfirms, so on, that view, that there's a practical choice between, on the one hand, social liberals who are capable of forming government, the liberals or social liberals who are capable of forming government, the Democratic Party in the United States, or the Labour Party in Britain, etc., etc. And on the other hand, the People's Front of Judea, or the Judean People's Front. Okay, this is satire, but in reality, that satire reflects something very fundamental about the working class as a class and the nature of workers' movement as a movement. In order to have a class movement, the working class needs solidarity. That means that it needs the cooperation of people who have different political ideas. Without the cooperation of people who have different political ideas, you can't have trade unions, you can't have cooperatives, you can't have tenants associations, you can't have mutual funds. So that the insistence of the far left on organising a raft of radically competing groups which say very similar things, very similar bureaucratically controlled things, trying to speak to the masses, each doing their own tactical orientation to this or that or the other section of the masses, says to the working class as a class, these left groups have got fucking to do with us. And create precisely the left tries to get in connection with the working class by these tactical manoeuvres to create broad fronts and so on. But the tactical manoeuvres to create broad fronts and so on create the split and divided organisations saying very similar things to the class, and the split and divided organisations saying very similar things to the class creates unavoidably the vision that this has got nothing to do with the working class. Okay, so what this poses is a voluntary choice to unite as communists or as Marxists or whatever the hell you want to call it, as communists is the way we put it this evening. That is to say, to unite among ourselves without making a particular tactic or a particular broad front project a precondition for unity. Without making it a condition of unity, it has to be towards, it has to include the Labour official left, or it has to include the Labour bureaucracy, it has to be on the basis of the trade unions, or whatever the hell it is. That possibly can break the infernal circuit of efforts to reach the masses, which produce very similar front organisations, which then produce the Judean People's Front, the People's Front of Judea, and therefore turn off the masses. It doesn't take you immediately to the masses, it takes you to the appearance of unity, having the possibility of creating something of a snowball effect. The classic case is the unification of the Marxists and the Lassalleans in 1875. Gotha unified two organisations, one of about 5,000, one of about 10,000, I can't remember, so bigger than we've got anyhow, but nonetheless, the unification of those two organisations produced a snowball effect which snowballed up very rapidly to 100,000 and survived through a decade of inequality, and came out at the end of it as the lowest mass party. And the unification processes, almost all of the mass socialist parties of the Second International came out of similar unification processes between different groups. The Heinfeld Conference of the Austrian democracy, which launched its program, was a unification conference of a series of small socialist groups at once. The Section Française de l'Internationale Ouvrière, the French Socialist Party, was created as a unification of several different groups, and so on. But then how? And there are the basic point, which is the most fundamental point, is at the end of the day, this is a voluntary choice. It is not the case that we are sectarian because we're separated from the masses, because we can be deeply engaged with the mass struggle and yet be deeply sectarian. Look at the British left as it was in the 1970s. We were all, none of us were saying, don't go on strike. The SLL said why we're not marching in Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, but that certainly didn't stop the SLL from being heavily engaged in the strike struggles, the actual mass struggles of the working class. It's the exact reverse. We're separated from class by virtue of our voluntary choice to build competing organisations at a low political level. But beyond that voluntary choice, there are things which we practically need in order to overcome that. And my first point is that it has to be on the basis of a programme, and some things about that programme. Second point, it has to be on the basis of an organisational practice which allows us to have differences out and have an educational internal discussion. My third point, which is much more general point, which is much more tenuous, is that it has we can't do it just on the basis of, say, suppose CPGB were to launch an appeal to the left to unite. This wouldn't work. And indeed, actually, we've had a series of attempts of one sort or another of small groups launching appeals to unite, because, and it won't work, and I'll come back and brief to this. So first point, it has to be on the basis of a programme. Precisely the existing organisations at the far left are unified on the basis of a tactic or on the basis of some theory. So the Socialist Workers' Party is on the basis of Cliff's theory of state capitalism, or on the basis of personal trust in an individual. That, of course, was the nature of the Socialist Labour Party. It's also the nature of the Corbyn movement. This was Jeremy Corbyn was a man on a white horse. Peter Taft, the split in the Committee for Workers International reflected the extent to which the Taftite, that organisation is a cult around the personality of Peter Taft. To be honest, actually, I've been reading a little bit of stuff about the splits in socialist appeal / international Marxist tendency. It looks as though that's actually a cult around Alan Woods. Originally, it was a cult around Ted Grant, but Alan Woods has inherited the mantle. So, on the basis of a programme, not on the basis of tactics, not on the basis of theories, not on the basis of trust in persons. Secondly, the programme needs to aim unequivocally beyond capitalism. So it needs to be a socialist / a communist programme. The reason why is because as long as we cling to what is achievable within capitalism as the basis of unity, the consequence is we're still within the framework of possibilism. We're still, therefore, within the framework of tailing either the liberals or the Conservatives, or this year tailing the Liberals, next year tailing the Conservatives. So we need to think, and I thought Michael Roberts in his talk earlier made the point, we need to actually propose planning. It's not enough to say we're for a mixed economy, we're for etc. etc. We need to propose methods of planning in the interior, planning in kind, and the reduced use of money. So we need, in that sense, a strategic goal which goes beyond capitalism. Secondly, on the other side of this coin, the programme needs to contain minimum conditions for willingness to enter government and vote for budget. Again, practical politics, we have seen over and over again in the recent past, left organisations which wreck themselves by entering into or supporting capitalist governments. Syriza is the most spectacular example, but equally Rifondazione, going in as a minority for the sake of lesser evilism against the Italian right. Rifondazione destroys itself by its support for a government which is supporting the Afghanistan war, and leaves behind, from an organisation of the best part of 100,000 people, that leaves behind gravel, far left, which is weaker than the British far left at the present day. That's an extraordinary structure. And this is not a novel piece of information, because it's Marx and Engels' critique of Louis Blanc's entry into the revolutionary government in 1848, repeated over and over again by Marx and Engels in the 1880s and the 1890s, thought about by the Second International in relation to, quote, Wielerrondism. And the left, the communist left, has been massively disoriented by thinking of, quote, the government is an arena for struggle. The Iraqi Communist Party say, we will enter into coalition governments because the government is an arena for struggle. But the Trotskyists have been utterly disoriented by the slogan of the workers' government from the Third Congress of the Comintern, Fourth Congress of the Comintern, which the Fourth Congress of the Comintern was utterly unable to concretize, because at the end of the day, in order to concretize the slogan of the workers' government, you need a minimum programme. I'm not utterly committed to the expressions maximum programme and minimum programme, but you need part of your platform which says we will not support a government unless, and the unless is primarily political democracy demands. The creation, the replacement of standing army by English militia, the abolition of the judicial review of legislation, the abolition of second chambers, the abolition of monarchies, the abolition of directly elected presidencies, etc., etc., etc. But also, actually, the stuff which is unavoidably, Mark Mulholland's made the point tonight, you can't have working class government without overthrowing the dependence of the government on deficit financing through the central bank. So you need nationalisation of the banks and finance houses. It's not an economic demand of part of the top 200 monopolies. It's a political demand about how you can have a government which is independent of the capitalist class. As I said, we don't necessarily have to formally use the terms maximum programme and minimum programme. They have the advantage of history, but the disadvantage of history. The disadvantage of history is because Karl Kautsky wildly in his book Social Revolution, the day after the Social Revolution, massively confused what the minimum programme is. It expressed the minimum programme as the uncompleted tasks of the bourgeois revolution, which is totally not what Marx intended when using when, or the Marxists in France, which is where the expression was coined in France in the 1880s. Second point, we need an organisation of practice which allows trends which have sharply distinct philosophical and theoretical views and tactical views to coexist and collaborate in practice on common ground. I've expressed that very vaguely, but clearly it involves the rejection of the ban on factions, it involves the rejection of the ban on permanent factions, it involves rejection of the idea that there's a radical Chinese war between external discussion and internal discussion. We need to operate on the basis of the Lenin comment that it's a question of action which is ongoing right now. If the election has been called and you insist on calling for a vote for the Liberal Party, that's scamming. But if the election has not yet been called and you argue that the party ought to enter into a coalition with the Liberal Party, that's not scamming. So open discussion within the context of the ability, and I said the ability to take decisions, so you have to reject equally networkism. We have to assert the right to disassociate as necessary, so it's not just the freedom to associate, but the freedom to disassociate, in particular the right to withdraw support from elected representatives. The American comrades were talking about this as a concrete question. It was actually a concrete question all the way through the Corbyn period in the Labour Party and back when in the 1970s, 1980s. And it's actually a characteristic problem of the organisation, Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, that it turned this concrete question, can we pick out the pro-capitalist MPs out of the party? Can we disassociate, de-endorse sitting MPs into we're for Labour Party democracy and not thereby de-gutting it of its actual class content, which is how do you act against scabs. We need a general acceptance and willingness to be a minority, that if it turns out you're a minority, conversely, the majority has to be willing for it to be the case that they may lose their majority. The majority has to be willing for it to be possible that the minority will win. The minority has to be willing for it to be the case that they aren't going to get their way, but they can carry on discussing inside the party. We've had endless splits which have happened of one sort or another because either the majority kicks out the minority, or in the case of the TAF split, the minority kicks out the majority by virtue of the possession of the apparatus. Or because comrades think they can get fresh fields and pastures new and have a great success. But the problem with that is it takes you back to Judean people's front of Judea. The formula democratic centralism, again, I said the formula maximum program, minimum program, the formula democratic centralism is worth fighting for reclaiming it, or democratic centralisation, which is what the SPD, the SPD writers use rather than democratic centralism. So interesting, I guess it's one of these German or Russian translation issues that they mentioned in starting using the expression democratic centralism. It's worth reclaiming, but at the same time, if we can't reclaim it, which is not possible because it's much more poised than the word communist. The underlying principles, however, we do have to fight for. My third general point, and this is the winding up point, we can't say this categorically, but the evidence to date is pretty clear that it won't work to try to go round the existing organisations and launch a unity initiative with small forces. We've had a real series of attempts of this sort. For example, the Unified Socialist Party in Liverpool, which lasted from 2004 to 2009. Left Unity has turned into, it's just another group. It was launched as a unity initiative, but turned into just another group, etc., etc. People's Front did. There's a reason for this. And the theoretical reason for this, as I understand it, is this, that the class struggle, the working class in the course of the class struggle, spontaneously throws up a social stratum of people who are permanent activists. That doesn't mean they're always running around selling papers and doing blah, blah, blah. It means that they're constant, they're permanently paying attention to politics, and that they're engaged in the long-term work of building organisations and trade union activism, and etc., etc., etc. This stratum is not purely drawn out of the working class, it's drawn out of the working class plus elements of the middle class who are attracted to the working class's offering an alternative. But it's a social stratum which is produced by the conditions of the bigger running class struggle between capitalists and proletarians. It's an illustration, I think, it's worth commenting, I think, that in the Soviet similar regimes, this stratum could never develop because any strike was immediately decapitated, either by, on the one hand, any strike was immediately decapitated either by the activists being killed or sent to psychiatric institutions or the gulag, or alternatively recruited into the apparatus, which was something which quite frequently happened to strike leaders. And on the other hand, the middle classes, the dynamic of the radicalisation of the middle classes in the Soviet regime was towards pro-Americanism, not towards the working class, precisely because the working class couldn't, because the bureaucracy could not enter into endemic open conflict over wages and hours and conditions with the working class, and the working class couldn't enter into endemic open conflict with the bureaucracy. The consequence was that the workers' movement did not form a pole of attraction to the middle class. You turned against it, and you didn't get the element. So you couldn't get a party, and therefore you couldn't get a political revolution. Okay, the point being then, this social stratum exists. So if you go to the masses, as for example, the Independent Workers' Working Class Association went to the masses in East Oxford and won, I think, in the end of the day, 3 council seats through doing base building work. But they won those seats through doing base building work because the Labour Party assumed that the seats in question were safe seats and didn't bother doing the base work, which a Labour Party. So once the IWCA were there, two things happened, one of which was that the IWCA members who came had very little idea about what to say about more general political issues affecting the council. So they could talk comfortably about housing questions or about the need to get drug dealers off the Blackburn Police estate. But their ability to talk about traffic management issues or any of the other things which also city council was concerned with was very limited. And conversely, the Labour Party just poured resources into the seats and took them back. Go work on the estates, go do elementary trade union work, you're going to come across labour rights. And in reality, actually, a lot of places, you're not only going to come across labour rights, you're going to come across official communists. If you don't go, not only official communists, actually, in quite a lot of small towns, you're going to come across the SWP as being the major landlord organization. I just said, I started out, I walked around East Oxford, there's a whole bunch of socialist appeal stickery. That doesn't really, socialist appeal, I've seen them on a few demonstrations, it's only half a dozen. They're just very active, young kids, busy going around stickery, which is a fairly low level activity. But nonetheless, it gives a push. So the reality is, it's illusory to imagine that you can go to the masses and no one else will be there, because the rest of the left also goes to the masses. The left are not, the left sects are not sects because they abstain from the mass movement. They're sects because they go into the mass movement in order to compete with the other groups on offering very, 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 very similar political lines. But then the consequence, the United Socialist Party gets nowhere. The new anti-capitalist initiative gets nowhere. Platypus announces the death of, quote, the old left, the new left, the millennial left, but actually what Platypus does is to engage in debates with representatives of the old left, the new left, and the announcement of the death of the left that Platypus makes. Although it reasonably describes the fact that the left is deeply disoriented, calling this death is sectarianism. It's the side of Platypus which is Spartacus. But nobody except us is the revolutionaries. So the consequence of this is, I don't think we can launch a new unity initiative. I don't think we and a number of other small groups can launch a new unity initiative. We need to keep, I'm sorry, problematic is banging away on ideological polemic with the larger organisations, large organisations and the small organisations in favour of an actual unification on a principle basis.